I'm very excited about this session. This is the state of Washington, or the view from Washington is what we're calling it. And this is always something that I think is really interesting. There's obviously a lot going on in DC that's affecting all of us, individual government, states, businesses, nonprofits like XBRL US. So very, very interesting topic and very interesting times that we're in. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, and then we'll cover a few CPE questions, and then we'll get you back on for the next session. But so the session today is being conducted by Cornelia Chebano, and she's the director of the Washington office of the National Association of Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers, or NASACT. NASACT is a national organization, and she serves as the primary liaison with Congress, with the administration, with federal agencies and other associations on national issues of intergovernmental finance. She represents state governmental positions. She provides information membership, and she assists in the development of policy positions. Cornelia has been the point person for state finance officials in implementing pandemic aid statutes and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. She's a past co-chair of the National Grants Partnership and is on the advisory board of Thomson Publishing's Information Services. Cornelia has also served on the board of directors of the International Consortium on Governmental Financial Management. So we're thrilled to have Cornelia with us today. I really appreciate her taking the time to provide us with her insights, and I want to welcome her onto the stage.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Michelle. Do you want to do your polling questions now or after the session?
I think after the session.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Pay attention. Okay, I'll see it.
In 1 second here, for some reason the screen sharing is not working on my end. Not sure what you can see there. Looks good. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I was just coming up to tell you it looks good, but I'll head backstage again.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank XBRL US and University of Denver for having me this afternoon, and all of the sponsors as well for this session. I've been able to listen to quite a few of the presentations so far, and I found them to be very interesting. And I'll add a little on what Treasurer Young said this morning in terms of some struggles that we're having trying to attract CPAs to state government and CPAs overall entering the workforce. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But let's go ahead and get started with the slides. And this is just some of the topics I'm going to cover. I'm going to give you some basic background. By now, you know that the Republicans hold both the White House and both chambers of Congress, but we'll do a little bit of background on that. Obviously, we'll talk about the recent presidential rescission bill and the potential for a new one, the One Big Beautiful Act, and we'll stick mostly to things that we have picked up on that will really affect state governments. But, you know, that bill is, I think, 787 pages, if I don't have that wrong, in total, and covers nonprofits, covers some individual businesses. There's all sorts of things in there, but we'll stick mostly to things that we think will affect state governments. And then, of course, the upcoming fiscal year 2026 budget. The Senate is still in town trying to wrap up, at least trying to get a few of those appropriation bills through, and the House has already adjourned. And then towards the end here, as I mentioned, we'll talk about some CPA workforce challenges and a few other regulatory issues that may not affect you directly, but certainly are things that we watch from the state financial management perspective. Okay, NASACT. What is NASACT? A lot of people will mistake it for NASA. We do not deal in space exploration. We are an association representing state financial management officials with the titles of auditor, controller, and treasurer. Those are both elected and appointed positions depending on the state. We are a nonpartisan organization, so we provide facts only. We don't necessarily take positions or push an agenda one way or the other. We try to provide facts where we see them to regulators and to federal agencies. based on things that could be detrimental, but don't push a particular agenda. We collaborate a lot with other organizations, and I'll talk about just in a moment some of the work that we do with the National Association of State Budget Officers, who provide us with a lot of information sort of on where things are going with state budgets. I think that's all I have to say about us. And at the end is my contact information. Feel free at any time to contact me about anything that's in this presentation, or if you have any questions overall, love to hear from you. Okay, this actually is a slide that came from Gila Bronner of the Bronner Group, who is one of our corporate affiliates. And I thought it was important to stick that in here. You know, when everything started happening, when President Trump came into office early this year, it was very fast moving. A lot of executive orders were issued, a lot of sort of unknowns, uncertainty, and people just really didn't know what was happening. They were very concerned about the DOGE coming in. But Gila, you know, made a good point, and I took this slide from her, that these reform efforts are not new. Over the years, we've seen several different presidents on both sides of the aisle with different types of reform efforts. Limiting the reach and growth of government was a Reagan initiative. Reinvention under President Clinton. President Obama had a modernization initiative. And of course, now we have President Trump's DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that's looking to reduce the federal government. And changes often, you know, go across administrations. For instance, some of the things we work on in terms of grants managements have just been renamed. There's been new groups established, but they've lasted, you know, over different administrations. So they basically repackage a lot of the efforts that are already underway. And so I just thought this was good as a background piece to show that we've had reform efforts in the past. This may seem a little, like I said, stuff coming out very quickly, jolting in some cases, but we've seen some of this before. So we try to put this slide in there just to tell people that there are opportunities with change. Many of us have been through changes of an administration, you know, in our jobs with state government or otherwise. And so there's always change that goes along when you have a new administration come into town. And just for background, you know, we already know these statistics here. As I mentioned, the House, Senate, and the President are being controlled by the Republican Party. And in here, we currently have 4 vacancies in the House. Oh, sorry about that. And that's due to several deaths, and those positions we filled here in September, the September timeframe. We should have some new folks coming in. And those vacancies currently, we have Representative Raul, I'm going to get this wrong, Grujalva of Arizona, sorry about that, Sylvester Turner in Texas, Mark Green actually was a resignation in Tennessee, and then Jerry Connolly in my district here in Virginia passed away just recently, and those seats again, as I mentioned, will be filled after the September elections. But the importance really of this slide is to show that there are very slim margins in both the House and Senate. And so while they can push their agendas, as we saw with the reconciliation bill, and that's a special procedure that we'll talk about in a moment, to try to move legislation through the Senate, which is more difficult than the House. This just is some background to show you that, you know, things are pretty, not a lot of, they can have not a lot of defectors on the Republican side in terms of getting their agenda through. And so the first days in office, when President Trump first came in office, it was very, like I said, boom, boom, boom. He issued 26 executive orders right at the get-go. Those are the highest number of first-day executive orders in U.S. history. The orders rolled back dozens of the Biden-era policies related to federal hiring, in-person work mandates, border emergencies, major immigration and energy directives. And again, this slide is more of a background piece on what transpired early in this administration. And one thing that we were watching pretty closely is the dismissal of those 17. There's some debate whether it was actually 19 inspector generals that were let go, and they called it a Friday night email that went out, and it was a little unsettling, although it's not uncommon for inspector generals to be replaced when we have a new administration. It was a little different this time that it occurred so quickly, and the law does require 30 days notice of dismissal to Congress, and that did not occur. So some of this was actually challenged in court. However, those inspector generals were dismissed, and now we're having some new ones that are being nominated. Of course, there's a legal risk in doing so on some lawsuits challenging whether Trump was actually illegal in removal of these inspector generals. And it puts independence at risk. And for those auditors out there, independence is very important. Replacing watchdogs with partisan figures could be a weakness in terms of executive actions. But anyway, so that was just something that we watched very closely. And then, as you know, DOJ was created right there in the first part when he came into office, and he set in motion several actions, as I just discussed, reducing the federal workforce, and then those on addressing illegal immigration, and just a lot of these things were done in the first couple of days of office. So it seemed very, people were very uncertain as to what was happening. And this was just something that he did it in his previous administration. This was just quicker in terms of that this all occurred in the first couple of days in office. They always talk about the first 100 days, and he got quite a few things done in those first 100 days, but a lot of these things were done right there in the first couple of days in office. And so we want to remind ourselves, when you were trying to find these actions up on their website, there were not only executive orders that were released, but there were memorandums as well. And I just want to point out there's some difference in that. When he issues an executive order, when a president issues an executive order, there actually must be a Federal Register notice. Some of those came out after it was actually posted on the website and the news media, but there were Federal Register notices on these executive orders. The executive orders also must cite the authority that the president has to undertake these different initiatives related to stopping action on any federal policy or management initiatives. And a memorandum is somewhat different. It's an instruction to federal agency officials. It's very similar to the executive order, but does not have to be necessarily citing the authority that that's based on. It's more of a sort of an administrative order that he sends out to his federal agencies. And then proclamations, those are generally just ceremonial type events or relating to private individuals and commemorating those types of folks. Okay, the Department of Government Efficiency. This was actually established early on. I think it was actually January 20th when the memorandum came out, or the executive order rather, sorry, to establish the Department of Government Efficiency. And this particular agency sits within the federal government with its stated objective to modernize information technology, maximize productivity, cut excess regulation and spending, and rebrand. So this was the Department of Government Efficiency is actually just rebranding the existing U.S. Digital Service, which sits housed directly in the executive office of the president. As you probably know from reading news articles over the past couple of months, they've been putting initiatives to decrease the size of the federal government, to modernize, looking at different software development, the network infrastructure between agencies, interoperability federal agencies, and unfortunately that they have also required some agencies full access of things that some would say were classified records. So there's some debate there. And this is a temporary unit, and it actually expires July 4th of 2026. Although I think the White House has said that the purpose will extend beyond that 2026. This was the first executive order that actually was implementing this DOJ that was put into place right when he came in office. And their charge was to initiate these large-scale reductions in force, or RIFs, as they're referred to. And you have to hire no more than one for 4 people that are departing. Certain exemptions, of course, were in place for public safety, law enforcement, immigration. Any sorts of reductions in force had to develop a plan, and they needed to have consultation with the DOJ team leads. They banished some temporary employees, and those, of course, have been a lot of those have been challenged in court as well. However, they also, as you know, did some buyout plans. According to, I have let's see here. Washington Post, federal civilian workforce has dropped by 26,000 positions and over 260,000 employees. They've either retired, taken these early buyouts, or have been terminated. And so that's the numbers that are being quoted there. They had that, if you recall, the deferred resignation program. I believe it's more than 154,000 federal employees were also on paid leave and through these buyout terms through the June of 2025. And according to the Washington Post, again, that cost the federal government about $21.7 billion in terms of the buyout and leave costs. And this is actually an executive order that went further on implementing the DOGE and their cost and efficiency objectives. And it's called Defend the Spend. So in terms of our folks, a lot of our people responsible, and not everybody, but the controllers in many states actually do the draws for their own state agencies in terms of drawing down funds from the federal government. So there was an executive order, obviously, to implement the DOGE cost-cutting initiatives. And through that, they had this new Defend the Spend process that mandated that people trying to draw down money now had to have a more explanation in terms of demonstrating the necessity of those funds. And it was mostly in the HHS programs. And then one of the largest draw systems for HHS is the payment management system. And they did notify people that non-discretionary grant programs were exempt. Some of the things that they were looking for in terms of what were the funds spent on, why were the expenditure necessary and reasonable, did it align with some of the terms of the grants and awards, the cost to comply with the rules, and support each expenditure with proper documentation. And this was a new thing that was added, a new field added in terms of when people tried to draw the money, which caused delays in some cases of getting the funds. One of our members had told us that the notice of Defend the Spend actually came out on a Friday evening with a date to go into effect on Monday morning. And so they worked through the weekend trying to figure out how for each draw that they were needed to do for the states, how they were going to meet this requirement to now support each expenditure coming down that they would draw from the draw systems. And where are we now with the DOGE? As you know, Elon Musk, who was heading up some of the initiatives at DOGE, has stepped down from his position leading that effort. A lot of the lower level DOGE folks are still working in some of the agencies. They're still looking at efficiencies to continue these types of actions, how they can reduce the federal government workforce, how they can achieve efficiencies throughout the programs. And then the rescissions bill that we're going to talk about in a moment actually carried out some of those cuts that were proposed by the DOGE in terms of the USAID and some of the other public radio and some other things that we'll talk about that in a moment in terms of the rescissions. Presidential actions, as I mentioned, there were a lot of executive orders that came out almost immediately. And one of the things that the states were very concerned about was under the Unleashing American Energy executive order. And that the biggest thing that we were looking at was the pause and disbursement of funds that were made available under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Specifically, those were a lot in terms of green energy grants and loans that were paused. And again, it's just the uncertainty of not knowing when that money might be released. There was additional views that the Office of Management Budget and each federal agency had to look at these funds to determine if they met the objectives. And then, of course, the pause also had to do with rescinding some of President Biden's actions that were through the Inflation Reduction and Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These Green New Deal type programs included things like electric vehicle infrastructure, charging and fueling infrastructure grants, renewable energy efficiency, and those types of things under the energy exploration. And again, this was just another initiative where the money to states were paused and also to nonprofits and others. And this actually has been since rescinded. There's been a lot of talk in the news and everywhere else. And this was actually a memo that came out. And there was a lot of confusion around this memo. The memo came down saying that there was a temporary pause of all agency grant loans and other financial assistance. And people were really concerned about not being able to draw their funds for cash flow purposes and others. There was a lot of uncertainty as to actually what was in the memo. And that came out January 27th, so shortly after the president took office, and it came out on the 27th and was therefore effective on the 28th. We had a lot of phone calls on this particular memo, was mandating the temporary suspension of not only existing obligations, but those new disbursements of federal grants. And it was implicated by several of the president's executive orders, particularly those that targeted DEI, foreign aid, environmental initiatives, and other programs that were set forth in some of his first actions that were rescinding Biden initiatives there on his first day in office. After that, a Q&A memo was immediately, because of all the not uncertainty as to the meaning and a lot of the confusion that was out there, they did issue a scope clarification. And then in that clarification, it talked about exempting programs that benefit individuals directly, such as Medicare, Social Security, other types of assistance like Medicaid, SNAP, Pell Grants, student loans. And they said that those were outside of the pause, and that the agencies were required to submit detailed information on paused programs by February 10th. However, it was immediately challenged in court. And then shortly thereafter that this memo was rescinded. So the pause that was set forth in this memorandum was actually rescinded by the White House. And then again, as I mentioned, there was a lawsuit, and that courts found that the administration's continued selective freezes despite the memo's withdrawal, and ordered funding to resume immediately. Another thing that affects us directly is this idea of hiring freeze and reducing the federal workforce. There was a memo that was issued almost immediately in terms of not being able to hire people for not only people that had taken the early outs or retired, but any open positions in the federal government. Obviously, there's some exemptions from that. It initially was 90 days from January 20th, and then it was again extended through July 15th. Then again extended through October 15th of this year. So we still have that hiring freeze in terms of federal agencies. And you're probably, one example that we have that we deal with in our line of work is the Division of Cost Allocation Services. We understand that 2 offices were closed and that they were not allowed to rehire people, and they were working with a very reduced staff. And that's in terms, of approving our cost allocation plans for state governments. And so those were already backed up, and now we suspect that they'll be backed up even further because of the hiring freeze and some of the things happening with the reduction in workforce and staffing at the federal level. IRS obviously is facing significant staffing challenges. And for us, that has to deal with our payroll and our reporting processes on the controller side. We anticipate we're going to see future reductions. And we'll talk a little bit about a Supreme Court case as to whether some of these reductions are legal or not. But a lot of this stuff is going through in terms of a recent Supreme Court case that was allowing them to move forward with these reduction in force initiatives. Unfortunately, those plans, to my knowledge, have not been made public. So the RIF plans at the various agency, you read about them. There's been some leaks, but they're not publicly available, to my knowledge, up on a website. Again, this was just the issue July 7th, and this was just extending that hiring freeze through October 15th of this year. And again, it doesn't prohibit you moving around some people, or specifically for some of the appointed positions, you can make staff reallocations, but there is a freeze in effect for federal government employees. Okay, so the Supreme Court on July 8th, sorry about this, under the February Workforce Reduction Executive Order, so that was that first executive order that went into place before they extended it, the Supreme Court preliminary upheld federal agencies were required to submit their reduction in force plans in 2 different phases by March 13th and then by April 14th. Some of those plans have received implementation approval from OMB, but the Supreme Court also left open the possibility that any particular agency's reduction plan could be invalidated by the courts. Supreme Court is really commenting on the administration's power and what it can do in terms of reshaping the federal government. However, it's not totally prohibiting them from moving forward and taking efforts to reduce the size of the workforce. So essentially, this doesn't mean that the administration ultimately cannot be stopped from making broad sweeping reductions, but they've got to do it correctly. And so many agencies since the Supreme Court have moved forward after the ruling. Our understanding is that HHS, Veterans Affairs, and some others under their RIFs, also through their voluntary retirements and buyouts and some earlier actions, are meeting targets and reducing their federal employees. And the legal battles continue. Stay tuned. While courts have paused orders requiring disclosure of RF plans, appeals are starting to play out in that regard. Check on the time here. Okay. This is just something that I highlight. This was a very early executive order entitled Regulatory Freeze Pending Review, and that any new or proposed rule had to be reviewed by an agency head or the president. And then they could also withdraw rules that were submitted to the public, but not published yet in the Federal Register. And this is really just a reminder that there's a significant review process that's now in place in terms of regulatory actions. And so that will slow things up significantly. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. OMB's Memo 2520, Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation. This executive order basically establishes a deregulatory strategy where every new rule requires forgiving 10 old rules. And then it's also got to be coupled with a net negative regulatory cost mandate. If you remember back in Trump's first administration, I believe we had the 4-for-1 requirement. This time it's 10-for-1. It could reverse prior regulatory analysis. And then one of my questions was in terms of the FTTA, because the first part of the FTTA is a proposal. Does this go into the effect in terms of the 10-for-1 requirement? My understanding is that it could be affected by that. We just don't know for sure in terms of, how many regulations they'll have to repeal before they can put one forth. There's a lot of proponents that see this as a critical tool in terms of enhancing economic prosperity, and then there's also some downsides, obviously, in terms of public welfare and any unintended consequences by not having regulations coming forth in the time period that it takes now to issue a singular regulatory action. This was just something I put in there, also somewhat alarming to some folks, assuring accountability for all agencies. This is the first time that independent agencies now have to submit their proposed regulations through the White House. And this includes agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commissions, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And again, these are just slowing down actions that in the past, independent agencies did not have to submit those for review. Again, I put this in here. It's more of background, and you guys have heard recently in the news a lot going on, even in this particular session, this conference that we're having on this online conference, talking about the use of AI, putting some parameters around AI. And just last week, the president did issue 3 different executive orders, one on procurement, one on infrastructure, and then one on IA, artificial intelligence imports. This is a shift in government policy, more towards the digital asset industry, promoting United States leadership of digital assets and financial technology. And I won't get into what each one of those executive orders does, but we're seeing a lot in the area of artificial intelligence and trying to obviously I'll promote as well digital assets, such things as stable coins and others. And we'll see more reviews and more information out of the agencies in terms of how these will be set forth. Another Supreme Court case that was extremely important, that was actually came out of the instruction by the president in terms of his executive order to refuse birthright citizenship to children born in the U.S. to parents who are non-citizens or unauthorized immigrants. This particular executive order challenged that. And basically what it came down to is they didn't really address the issue at hand. What they did address is that you can't use a nationwide ban or a nationwide injunction, but does signal preference for more limited injunctions to apply only to parties in a specific case. So you can't say it's nationwide, but you can do for specific cases and specific areas of the country. I'm sorry. Rescissions. The next big thing that we have seen in the past couple of weeks is this idea of presidential rescissions. Under the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, the president can request that Congress rescind, revoke funds that have already been appropriated but not yet have been spent. This really is trying to maintain the balance of power between the executive and legislative branch. And it's really canceling previously approved spending. We've also recently heard in the news this idea of pocket rescissions, which vary a little bit from a regular rescissions process, and that it's got to be within 45 days of the end of the fiscal year. And so that's being debated a little bit up on the Capitol Hill and in the news. And will this pocket rescission be used here as we approach the end of the federal fiscal year? And what happens there is they rescind the funds until the clock runs out, and then the funds basically expire. Here's the Rescissions Act that actually did pass into law. I believe it was, yeah, here we go. On July 24th, the president did sign that. And as you know, that was targeting things that were part of the spending reductions proposed in the DOGE, foreign aid, funding for the public broadcasting and others. As proposed, it was 9.4 billion in spending cuts, but I think as it actually went through, it ended up being about 9 billion. There was an AIDS program in there that was actually removed as the final bill passed through both the House and Senate. And all of these things, we'll talk a minute about the Big Beautiful Act, are happening, I mean, more quickly than I've seen. It was approved on July 18th and then 23rd in the Senate, and then it went back to the House and was approved on the 16th, and then the president actually, I'm sorry, the House then approved it on the 18th, and then it was actually signed by the 24th. So things are happening pretty rapidly. Rescissions have not happened for a very long time. And so this was it was something where you're looking at money being rescinded that Congress had already authorized. And will we see more of these? The Director of Office of Managed Budget says he's teeing up some additional rescissions, as I mentioned. The pocket rescissions, that's basically withholding those without any congressional approval. And we'll see. We've also heard some things in the news about Department of Education being the next agency to have some dollars rescinded. So watch for more to come. More to come on this. We'll see what's going to happen. I think I've got one more slide in here. Yeah, actually, and I think David Walker, who's speaking later on today, will probably go into the Impoundment Control Act a little bit. There's been a lot of controversy at GAO, and actually the House proposed a very cut budget for GAO in their proposal. The Senate did not necessarily go along with that, but my understanding is that the administration is very unhappy about a lot of GAO's opinions regarding the impoundment control, which restricts the president's ability to withhold those funds that we just talked about in terms of rescissions. And so we'll see what happens with that, and perhaps former Controller General Walker will have a little more information. He's a little closer to this, having gone through this in his term in office as well. So I'm not sure what to say. That there's all sorts of acronyms that are being floated around. I call it ABOA. Others might call it something different, but this is the idea of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's what it's being called. I didn't name it. I know there's been some consternation by some Democrats in the Senate about the name of the bill, but here it is. That's what it's called, and I'm going to refer to that as ABOA. It was the One Big Beautiful Bill was actually structured as a budget reconciliation package, and that's really to circumvent traditional filibuster requirements. And it integrates policy priorities from 10 different Senate committees into one unified legislative framework. As I mentioned, I think it was 870 pages, 877 as passed is my understanding, and it impacts virtually every industry, as I mentioned before, and household in the U.S. Significant policy shifts, funding reallocations, regulatory changes. We'll talk about a few of those. I'm only going to highlight again the ones that are specific for state government. And this just gives you what the process of reconciliation is. It allows you to pass a bill by 50 or 51 votes, rather than your 60 votes that are normally necessary to avoid a filibuster in the Senate. It's a special rule. The Senate has lots of special rules. It's also established by the Byrd Rule. And so anything that you try to pass under reconciliation has to meet one of these three things. It must not produce a change in outlays or revenues, increases the deficit beyond a budget window of 10 years, or make changes to Social Security. They can do one for each of these, so actually 3 they can do per year. Now we've done 1. My understanding is that we could have and we'll talk about that in a moment, that there could be a reconciliation 2.0. And so some of the wins in terms of the fact that they didn't touch the tax exemption for municipal bonds could be up again here towards the end of the year. The parliamentarian plays a big role in terms of deciding what's in or out under this Byrd Rule. They have to be directly fiscal in nature. And so they did pull some things out for the House passed a BOA that were not in the Senate one that was eventually signed by the president. Specifically, one of the things I'm thinking about was that the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, was going to move under the SEC, and the parliamentarian found that that was not in line with the Byrd Rule in terms of what could be considered in the bill, and that was thrown out. Other items that the parliamentarian removed were some cuts to the CFPB, reduction in Federal Reserve staff pay, and then the Office of Financial Research and Treasury, there was a cut to that wasn't considered relevant under the Byrd Rule. So that was removed when the final bill was passed. Here, this is just the timeline again. Things are happening very quickly. I would have never thought when the House was proposing that their own version of a BOA would be through by Memorial Day that would ever occur. But it not only it occurred, it bounced over to the Senate. There was a lot of debate back and forth. They advanced the bill and ultimately voted on that on July 3rd. And by July 4th, we had the president signing that bill, a huge bill, 879 pages, very costly in terms of its cost, and just really surprising about how quickly that it actually went through. And I believe also the Comptroller General later today will talk about some of the impacts of BOA on the federal deficit and some of the costs associated in that. The CBO recent estimate was that it'll increase the deficit by $3.4 trillion. There's been some differing opinions as to the actual cost, but that's what CBO's latest estimate will say. Some of the key provisions, obviously, as you know from reading the news, many of those 2017 tax cuts were permanent, including tax rates. There was a no tax on tips, overtime, and car loan, which I'm going to talk about just in a little bit, as that affects states, in particular our members, in terms of implementation, raises the debt ceiling by $5 million, makes a lot of changes in the Medicaid area. Another one that we were watching is the increase of the state and local tax cap, raised that from $10,000 to $40,000. Also rescinds a substantial amount of money from the Department of Transportation Neighborhood Access and Equity Grants. Something was thrown in there. And again, different requirements for SNAP and Medicaid in terms of the work that's required to be done. And some of that could roll down to the states. We'll talk about that just in a moment, and roll back the clear energy incentives. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but they did expand the work requirements in terms of the age that's required to now work 80 hours per month. There's some exemptions that are in there. The Medicaid funding reductions include, I think it's about $1 trillion in federal Medicaid cuts, but that's over a longer period of time. And I've got a really good slide from our friends at the National Association of State Budget Officers when I'll show you that the effect of this really occurs in the out years. But there's some mandates in here with different years that are involved. The eligibility, one thing that states did not have to do, and this is in terms of burden on existing staffing, is the verification. It's now 6 months that they need to verify eligibility for Medicaid rather than annually. Not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying in terms of things that the states now have to do. Also, there's some increases in terms of what the states may charge Medicaid, but all that's right here in the slides for you. Again, more strict criteria that beneficiaries may meet to justify and maintain enrollment in these different programs, and that would apply. So this is from NASBO. Expenditure impacts begin in future fiscal years, not necessarily this year, but in fiscal year 2026, those eligibility requirements come into place. 27, the Medicaid work requirements come into place, and it also increases the state share of SNAP costs from 50 to 75%. And then in fiscal year 2028, the medical provider tax is phased down for expansion states, and some SNAP benefit matches as well. And this slide, which actually came from KFF, which is an organization that does a lot of research on different medical programs, also came from NASBO as well. But this actually shows you that the cuts occur again in the out years. So as the years go by, this is going to be a bigger hit on the state budgets, as you can see there. Even 10 years from now, $165 billion in spending reductions. I'm not going to go into this a great deal. Again, even with the SNAP requirements, there's new eligibility and work requirements. Cost sharing shifts from the federal government to the states. As you can see here, the administrative costs increases from 50 to 75% that states may pick up the share of, and some different benefit calculations. So really some cost shifting in terms of the Medicaid and also SNAP from the federal government down to the states in this OBOA bill. And then one thing I will note on SNAP, that states have to start contributing to the food benefits that are that come through SNAP. The share is based on the state's contribution and is tied to payment error rates. In the past, the states only had to contribute to administrative costs and not to these specific food benefit shares. So this is something new as well. Again, I'm not an expert with SNAP or Medicare, but there is some cost shifting definitely happening in these two programs. The SALT, as I mentioned, they boosted the deduction from 10 to 40,000. And that's the deduction limit for payment of state and local taxes. However, this is only temporary and will phase out. It's only, I think it phases out by 2030. The deduction will then go back to $10,000. And this was a deal that was made with those SALT states where this is important. And then there's also a phase down for taxpayers with modified adjusted gross incomes of $500,000, and that's adjusted annually for inflation with a floor there of $10,000. So this was a big cost. It was something that was very controversial. And so that's why it's a temporary increase, at least for now. As I mentioned, if we move into a second reconciliation package, I know that there are people on the Hill that would like to make this increase permanent. Check the time. Okay. This is a big one, deduction for tip income. Again, now personal folks can deduct their tip income. No taxes on tip, basically, is what it was being sold as. And, I didn't think too much about it for state and local governments. And then somebody said, oh, what about state parks that have cafeterias or other areas within state government that may not also be thought of? And again, this is something for our payroll type people to have to report and sort through. And you can see here the different tips that can qualify for this deduction. And of course, that information will have to be reported down likely by the state folks that file information returns. Even more so, it's the tax on overtime. And one of the problems with this and with the tip is that the legislation, it's only a temporary exemption. So it's hard for people to get their hands around separating out overtime pay that some systems may not already do. And so folks do think that this could be a real headache. The statute and the IRS indicate that there's some transition relief that will be available since this is retroactive to 2025. However, the statute itself talks about estimates the notice out of the IRS did not talk about estimates. And so just lots of questions in terms of how this will actually be implemented, what will be required to be reported, and how states with existing systems can modify their systems to capture some of this information and report it. And then the fact that the provision again expires on December 31st, 2028. And so we really won't know a whole lot in terms of what happens here until we see the implementing guidance out of the Internal Revenue Service. And this is a debt limit. As you know, the debt limit is the cap set by Congress on the total amount of money that the Treasury is authorized to borrow to meet the government's existing legal obligations. This comes up almost every year. The obligations are things such as Social Security, Medicare benefits, military salaries, etc. Does not authorize any new spending, but allows the federal government to finance existing obligations that have already been enacted into law. And then once the limit is reached, which it was done in January, the Treasury does what they call extraordinary measures to keep the government operating. And again, the problem here is if they do not raise this limit, you could face a federal government default, which of course would be a big impact not only on our country, but states as well. And so that was actually raised in the ABOA bill, just worth noting. The bill also expands private activity bonds for spaceports. Spaceports are now treated like airports under the exempt facility bond rules. They're now eligible for private activity bonds and have to use those same rules that airports have to use. And interest on the bonds financing a spaceport is tax exempt, which obviously makes borrowing cheaper. And then the big thing in the bill that was a win for many people was preserving the muni bond tax exemption. And this boosts some near-term market stability and maintains that importance of using muni bonds to build infrastructure. So these were the big wins. Again, we did not eliminate or cap that exemption for municipal bonds, and I'll have to give props to the National Association of State Treasurers and the Government Finance Officers Association, who did a lot of work on the Hill in terms of educating people on the importance of municipal bonds and how they finance infrastructure across the United States. And so we were able to keep that out of this first reconciliation bill. However, my understanding is that this could be brought up again should there be a reconciliation 2.0 here later this fall. Also a big win, removed a moratorium that preempted state and local governments on artificial intelligence. That was a 10-year moratorium that preempted state and local governance of artificial intelligence. The preemption, if it would have passed, which it did not pass, would have prohibited state and local governments from enforcing any law or regulation governing artificial intelligence for 10 years, with some exemptions. So that was a win, especially for our folks that work with IT. And then there was some funding in ABOA for Homeland Security assistance, including some assistance for the Olympics and World Cups for state and local governments. So those were some wins that were in that bill. Again, reconciliation 2.0, is Congress looking at a reconciliation bill again? We understand that they are. We understand that the committees will pick up on things that were proposed that may not have made it into the first bill. They'll have to amend those some to meet the rules of the parliamentarian for that Byrd rule in terms of things that can be brought up through reconciliation. Most likely, we understand it would be an end of the year Christmas present, we're calling it. I don't know if it'll be a present or not, but that will go through towards the end of the year after they deal with the 2026 fiscal year budget. And of course, that will need for pay-fors, and what those pay-fors are in the first go out around the tax exemption for municipal bond was thrown out there because that raised some money in terms of how they scored the bill. So we'll see what happens in that regard. But again, stay tuned. Fiscal 2026 budget. I don't want to say too much about this. As you know, the fiscal year for the federal government begins in October and ends September 30th. So we're talking about the House of Representatives right now is out of session. They did pass several of their appropriations bills. The Senate has not passed any. They are still in session today and tomorrow, trying to get at least 3 of those appropriation bills passed before they adjourn for the August recess, excuse me. And then, of course, they come back right after the August recess, and they've got to do something before the end of the fiscal year, October 1st. What they've traditionally done in the past is what they pass a continuing resolution. Usually it's at this year's funding levels and continue on either short term, they can kick the can for a couple months, or they can do longer than that or less than that. But that they usually have a continuing resolution so they can come to some decisions on the spending for the budget of next year. We anticipate there'll be several cuts just based on what's being proposed by DOGE and some of the reduction in federal government. This is the skinny budget that was actually proposed by, you can hardly read it, but some of the provisions that were in that, but this is just the proposal by the president. My understanding is that many of the appropriation bills are not accepting what he's proposing in terms of cuts. But we're not early in the process per se, but they've not addressed many of these appropriation bills. So we don't know exactly what the cuts might look like when we see both the House and Senate versions and ultimately what will be passed. But this is just what the president has proposed in his budget submission. Again, this is just a proposal. There's going to be cuts again, as I mentioned before, uncertain. Effect on the states could be substantial, depending on the state's reliance on federal funds. The states can balance every year, so they're already looking to see where they might be able to cut their own programs to meet some of the cuts happening at the federal government. A lot of discussion going on in terms of that. We monitor those discussions, and we like to look for different insights in terms of what might happen, but we just don't know a whole lot just yet. Obviously, concerns about the federal funding, also concerns the bond market. Could there be some impacts in terms of the bond raters? We look at it in that regard as well, and also on how states may weather these types of things moving forward. Let's see the time. Okay, we're almost getting on the end of time, so I'm going to go really quickly through these. The slides will be available for you afterwards. I don't need to get into this, but Treasury is looking to recoup some of that money for people that may not have obligated the funds in the right manner. And that was for the state and local fiscal recovery fund. And that was the money that we got through the pandemic. And so that's ongoing right now. We haven't seen a whole lot. There are some smaller governments, I understand, that are receiving notices for recoupment, but we don't know a whole lot just yet. I haven't heard of any states in specific that have gotten these notices. This is just something we're watching for the accountability community. There was a memo that was issued that was direct for federal governments, and they're really looking at how the dollars at the federal level are audited, what value audits provide for the taxpayer. Are financial audits really meeting the charge, or do they need to look longer in terms of risk-based and performance? And so this was just a memo that we're watching could roll down in terms of what we do on the single audit for the state side, oversight, performance management. And again, I think this was really looking at addressing improper payments and waste, which we've heard a lot about in the news. And so take a peek if you're interested in this. The government's taking a whole of government approach in identifying improper payments. And I think this is just part of it. And what they're essentially saying is that compliance audits are no longer enough. We need to look at more performance and outcomes. I do want to highlight this really quickly. This is something that's of a big note, not only to state governments, but it came out of the Institutes of Higher Education, and that's in terms of what they can seek in terms of reimbursement for administrative costs for grants that they get from the federal government. My understanding is that for some of these, like the National Institutes of Health, before, sometimes those costs could exceed 60%, depending on what they negotiated with the federal government. And now there have been some memos that have issued that are trying to cap those costs at 15%. And you can see here, I mentioned NIH, but Department of Energy, and Department of Energy actually came out and said state 10% for state and locals. And we usually negotiate those costs through agreements in advance. And so that's a big deal, particularly for your higher ed folks. There's been a series of lawsuits. So at this point, everything's being temporarily blocked in terms of them trying to cap these costs. But what does this mean going forward for negotiated rates, for grant programs, and for the administration of those programs? So we're continue to keep an eye on that. again, agencies overall are looking at improper payments, program outcomes, how the technology might be able to enhance for federal dollars. We understand that they might start using bots for various agency actions. So the federal government as a whole is really looking into program outcomes and the use of technology to try to get out of the oversight of some of those federal dollars. I don't need to get into this. There's just a request that's out there for modernizing payment systems to address fraud, and the information is there. And these links are live once you get the slides if you have any interest. FDA, DTA, I'm going to mention really quick. So in general, as we talked about before, with all these regulatory restrictions that came through executive orders, much more complex for them to issue a regulatory action. So what does this mean for FDTA? As you know, the deadline for issuing that final joint rule has already passed, as was mentioned by Dave Sanchez yesterday. The municipal market part of that, which would affect us in terms of digitizing information that we would submit to Emma, that's 2 years after passage of the joint rule. So that's already been pushed out until we see that joint rule. Then they have 2 years to issue additional regulations on that. And then there are many off-ramps in the statute, and I think Dave might have alluded to that yesterday. You've got a scaling provision for smaller governments. There are things such as feasibility that are mentioned in the statutes, and so we'll see what the SEC comes up with in terms of requiring machine-readable information to be submitted to Emma and what that actually will entail. I'm not going to get into this. I mentioned it easy. I think we're out of time. We've got a real problem in state and local and overall, I think across the country, with the number of CPAs that are people that are going into the accounting industry. There's some good news in that there's some uptick recently in terms of enrollment in accounting programs. There's been some loosening of the requirements, the 150-hour rule in terms of what you needed to have to become a CPA. And there's some loosening on that in various states passing laws. And so we're seeing some movement forward, but the bad news is that you need CPAs for certain parts of government, for certain parts of private sector. And the folks that are achieving their CPA and going into government accounting have been on the downscale. So we did issue a report with the AICPA looking at these types of things, making some recommendations in terms of how we can better sell students on the value of going into government. And I'm going to end there. Just one more thing, sorry. Continued uncertainty, as I mentioned, the reduction in funding through the BOA cuts, the rescissions package, and then what we're going to see in the 2026 budget. This is uncertain for federal government, makes us nervous in terms of how we plan our own budgets. There's increased responsibilities that come along with these cuts in terms of what the states now have to pick up in delivering programs. The reduction in assistance in the federal workforce, there's nobody there to answer our questions. So this is affecting us in a number of different ways. And then, of course, the long-term effects of increases in federal debt, which I believe Comptroller General Walker will talk a lot about. And then just the constant changing requirements are a challenge for for state governments. Thank you. I had too much here to cover. As I mentioned, one thing I want to say is we continue to navigate these challenges, but there's often opportunities. How do we streamline? How do we look at our business processes? How can we deliver things in a more streamlined manner at a lower cost? And my contact information is there. Should you have any questions? Thank you. Sorry, Michelle, if I went over.
That's okay, Cornelia, this was terrific. This was really, really helpful. You covered a huge amount of information, and I know there's more to come, but I just want to get one question in from the audience that we got before I go to CPE, and that's, from your perspective, and also people are asking for the slides, so thrilled that we can provide the slides to everybody. From your perspective, how might a White House approval requirement for independent agencies like the SEC affect both the speed and perceived independence of accounting regulations, especially those involving FASB or GASB?
Well, of course, we're always concerned anything that would affect the independence and any oversight, whether it by intrusive oversight, whether it be by the White House or even Congress, is something that we watch for. GASB is an independent agency. They're not specifically covered under the executive order that I mentioned. It's more of these SEC and other people that have been are independent federal agencies. GASB is a regulator for state and local governments. But sure, always concerned when there's testimony up on Capitol Hill talking whether it be FASB or GASB, because they are supposed to be independent standard setter, and we want to make sure that there's no undue influence from either Congress or the White House.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Cornelia, thank you so much. I would give you a round of applause if we had a regular audience, but I'm sure everybody's clapping. So thank you so much. And I'm gonna let you take off and go to see the other session.